On a crisp Monday morning in downtown Boston, the gleaming glass towers of Atlantic Corporate Center reflected the rising sun like mirrors against the sky. Inside one of these prestigious buildings, on the 23rd floor, James Thompson moved quietly through the empty hallways with his cleaning cart, his navy blue uniform pristine and well pressed despite the early hour. At 52, James carried himself with quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his janitorial uniform. His salt and pepper hair was always neatly trimmed, and behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his dark eyes held an intelligence that most people failed to notice. Few knew that those same eyes had once surveyed boardrooms instead of bathroom stalls, or that the hands that now pushed a mop had once signed million-dollar contracts. Life had taken an unexpected turn for James during the 2008 financial crisis. His successful consulting firm, which he built from the ground up after graduating from Harvard Business School, had collapsed along with many others. The downfall had been swift and merciless, leaving him with mounting debts and a family to support. While many of his colleagues had bounced back through their connections, James had faced an additional barrier, one that came with the color of his skin. Now, 6 months into his job at Atlantic Corporate Center, James had settled into a routine. He arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, before most of the office workers began their day. The early morning solitude gave him time to think, to plan his eventual comeback while ensuring every surface gleamed to perfection. He took pride in his work, no matter what it was, a lesson his father had taught him long ago. The building was starting to wake up as James finished the executive floor. Security guards changed shifts, early birds trickled in clutching their coffee cups, and the elevators began their constant hum. He nodded politely to everyone who passed, though few acknowledged him. It was as if the janitor's uniform had rendered him invisible to most of the building's occupants. That morning, James noticed some changes on the 23rd floor. A new nameplate was being installed on one of the corner offices, Victoria Blackwood, Senior Vice President of Operations. Through the glass walls, you could see workers setting up expensive furniture and art pieces. The gossip among the cleaning staff had been buzzing about the new executive, another young hotshot brought in to shake things up. As James cleaned the windows nearby, he overheard 2 secretaries whispering over their morning coffee. "Did you hear about the new SVP?" one asked. "Apparently, she's got quite a reputation from her last company. Total nightmare to work with, especially if you're not in her inner circle." "I heard she made her last assistant cry every week," the other replied. "And don't even get me started on how she treats the support staff." James absorbed this information quietly, as he did most things. In his experience, reputations often had some truth to them, but he preferred to form his own opinions. Still, he made a mental note to be extra careful around the new executive's office. By 8 a.m., James was finishing up his morning rounds when the elevator doors opened and Victoria Blackwood strode out. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a designer suit, with sharp features and cold blue eyes that seemed to dismiss everything they saw as beneath her. Her heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor as she walked, trailing behind her a scent of expensive perfume. Their paths crossed as James was moving his cart aside to make way. He offered his usual polite smile and nod, but Victoria's response made his spine stiffen. She didn't just ignore him. She looked right through him with such blatant disdain that the air seemed to freeze between them. Then, as if noticing a speck of dust on her shoe, she wrinkled her nose and quickened her pace to her office. At that moment, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a familiar spark of challenge in his chest. He recognized the look in Victoria's eyes. He'd seen it countless times throughout his career, first as a student at Harvard, then as a rising businessman. It was a look that said, "You don't belong here." As he pushed his cart toward the service elevator, James allowed himself a small, knowing smile. He'd proved people wrong before, and something told him he'd get the chance to do it again. For now, though, he had work to do, and he would do it with the same excellence he applied to everything in his life. After all, true character, as his father always said, shows in how you act when you think nobody's watching. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria Blackwood's presence at Atlantic Corporate Center created ripples of tension throughout the building. Like a storm cloud casting shadows over a sunny day, her influence changed the atmosphere of the once peaceful 23rd floor. Each morning, Victoria arrived precisely at 8 a.m., designer handbag swinging from her arm, her steps echoing authority through the halls. Her first order of business had been to redecorate her entire office space, demanding the walls be repainted 3 times until the shade of white matched her exacting standards. 2 maintenance workers had already requested transfers to other floors, unable to tolerate her constant criticism. On this particular morning, James was cleaning the glass walls of the conference room when he witnessed Victoria's true colors in full display. Her new assistant, Maria Rodriguez, had apparently made a minor error in scheduling. "Are you completely incompetent?" Victoria's voice carried through the supposedly soundproof walls. "I specifically said the Johnson meeting needed to be at 2 p.m., not 2:30. Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" Maria, a capable young woman who had worked in the building for 3 years, stood trembling before Victoria's desk. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwood," they specifically requested. "I don't care what they requested," Victoria cut her off. "Fix it. Now, and while you're at it, get someone to clean this office properly. It's filthy in here." James watched as Maria hurried out, wiping tears from her eyes. The office, he noted, was spotless. He had cleaned it himself just an hour ago. As the days passed, Victoria's behavior grew worse. She seemed to take particular pleasure in belittling the building's service staff, especially those of color. James observed how she would purposely spill her coffee on freshly mopped floors, claiming it was already dirty anyway. She would loudly complain about fingerprints on glass doors while pressing her own hands against them and demand immediate cleaning even during busy meetings. One morning, James overheard an interesting conversation while emptying trash bins. 2 board members were speaking in hushed tones around the water cooler. "She's bringing in amazing results," one said, shaking his head. "Revenue's up 15% since she started." "But at what cost?" The other replied. "We've had 3 discrimination complaints already. HR is getting nervous." "As long as she keeps the numbers up, the board won't touch her. You know how it works." James absorbed this information silently, continuing his work. He understood the corporate world's obsession with numbers all too well. It was the same mindset that had contributed to his own company's downfall when he refused to lay off employees during the financial crisis. The situation came to a head one Wednesday morning. James was cleaning the windows in Victoria's office. She had complained about smudges during yesterday's client meeting, though everyone else saw nothing but pristine glass. Victoria stormed in, talking loudly on her phone. "I don't care about their diversity quotas," she was saying, purposely raising her voice. "I need competent people, not tokens." Her eyes fixed on James as she spoke, a cruel smile playing at her lips. James continued his work, maintaining his dignity despite the obvious provocation. His hands remained steady as he wiped the glass, his face composed. But inside, his mind was working, analyzing, planning, skills from his Harvard days that had never left him. As he packed up his cleaning supplies, Victoria ended her call and addressed him directly for the first time. "Make sure you actually clean properly this time," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Though I suppose this is the best we can expect from your kind of people." James turned to face her, maintaining eye contact for just a moment longer than comfortable. He smiled, not the servile smile she expected, but the confident smile of a man who had once commanded boardrooms. "Thank you for your feedback, Mrs. Blackwood," he said quietly, his cultured voice carrying years of education and refinement. "I always aim for excellence in my work." The brief flash of uncertainty in Victoria's eyes was worth more than any angry response. As James left her office, he knew that the real game was just beginning. Sometimes, he reflected, the best lessons come from unexpected teachers, and he had a feeling Victoria Blackwood was about to learn something she wouldn't forget. The morning of September 15th started like any other at Atlantic Corporate Center, but it would soon become a day that would change everything. Victoria Blackwood was hosting her biggest meeting yet, a potential partnership worth millions with Global Tech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. James arrived early that day, as usual, making sure the conference room was immaculate. As he finished polishing the last window, he noticed something unusual. The CEO of Global Tech Solutions, Marcus Johnson, was arriving an hour ahead of schedule. James recognized him immediately from business magazines, a self-made billionaire known for his strong stance on corporate ethics and workplace equality. Marcus Johnson stood in the hallway, observing the office dynamics while waiting for his early morning coffee. Dressed in a simple but expensive suit, He carried himself with quiet confidence. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but James saw how Johnson's eyes missed nothing, taking in every detail of the workplace environment. Victoria, unaware of Johnson's early arrival, was in rare form that morning. She stormed through the office, barking orders and leaving a trail of trembling employees in her wake. "These presentations better be perfect," she snapped at her assistant. "I won't have any mistakes today." As James went about his routine cleaning, he could hear Victoria rehearsing her presentation in the conference room. The door was open, and her voice carried clearly, "Global Tech Solutions needs us more than we need them. Once they see these numbers, they'll be begging to partner with us." The morning progressed, and more executives began arriving for the big meeting. James was carefully cleaning the glass walls outside the conference room when it happened. He was following his usual routine, moving methodically to ensure no streaks were left on the spotless surface. Victoria burst out of her office, arms full of presentation materials. When she saw James working on the windows, her face contorted with rage. "What are you doing here now?" she demanded loudly. "Can't you see we have important people coming?" James began to step back with his cleaning cart, but Victoria wasn't finished. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You people have no sense of timing or professionalism. Do you even understand how important this meeting is?" The hallway had gone deadly quiet. Several executives frozen in place, coffee cups halfway to their lips. James remained perfectly calm, his expression dignified despite the public humiliation. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began politely, "I was just finishing." "Don't talk back to me," Victoria cut him off. "Just get out of here. Go clean bathrooms or whatever it is you're qualified to do. And next time, learn your place." What Victoria didn't notice, in her moment of rage, was Marcus Johnson standing directly behind her, having returned from his coffee run. His face was a mask of carefully controlled anger as he witnessed the entire exchange. James saw him, though. He also saw the way Johnson's hand tightened around his coffee cup, the way his jaw clenched at Victoria's words. But James maintained his composure, years of business experience helping him recognize a pivotal moment when he saw one. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwood," James replied smoothly, his Harvard-educated diction perfect and clear. "I apologize for any inconvenience. I'll make sure the bathrooms are spotless for your important meeting." The subtle emphasis he placed on important wasn't lost on those watching, except Victoria, who was too caught up in her own self-importance to notice the shift in the atmosphere. As James turned to leave, Marcus Johnson stepped forward. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority, "I believe we need to have a different kind of conversation first." Victoria whirled around, her face draining of color as she recognized who had witnessed her behavior. She opened her mouth to speak, but for once, no words came out. "Mrs. Blackwood," Johnson continued, his tone arctic, "I make it a point to arrive early to observe how potential partners treat all their employees. It tells me more about a company's true values than any presentation ever could." The silence in the hallway was deafening. James quietly gathered his cleaning supplies, but before he could leave, Johnson turned to him. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I believe I'd like to hear your perspective on the workplace culture here. Would you mind joining us in the conference room?" And just like that, the power dynamics of the entire floor shifted. Victoria stood frozen, watching as her carefully planned meeting, and possibly her career, began to unravel before her eyes. The conference room of Atlantic Corporate Center had never felt so tense. James Thompson sat calmly at the massive oak table, his janitor's uniform standing in stark contrast to the expensive suits surrounding him. To his left sat Marcus Johnson, CEO of Global Tech Solutions, who had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, signaling this would be a long and serious discussion. Victoria Blackwood sat opposite them, her usual confidence shattered. She kept straightening her already perfect blazer, a nervous tic that betrayed her growing anxiety. The room was filled with other executives, including 2 board members who had been hastily summoned. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus Johnson began, "how long have you been working here?" "6 months, sir," James replied politely. His voice carried no hint of accusation or anger, just simple facts. "And during these 6 months, has this type of interaction been common?" James paused thoughtfully, his years of business experience guiding his response. I prefer to let the evidence speak for itself, he said, reaching into his uniform pocket and pulling out a small notebook. I documented every incident, complete with dates, times, and witnesses. Victoria's face paled further as James began reading from his meticulous notes. Each entry was precise, professional, and damning. Instances of racial slurs muttered under breath, deliberate coffee spills, discriminatory comments about hiring practices, and countless examples of workplace harassment. Additionally, James continued, the building's security system maintains video and audio recordings of all public areas. I believe the footage from the past 6 months would corroborate these accounts. The board members exchanged worried glances. One of them, Gerald Matthews, cleared his throat. Mr. Thompson, why haven't you brought these concerns to HR? James smiled slightly. In my experience, Mr. Matthews, timing is everything. As a former business owner and Harvard MBA graduate, I understand the importance of presenting a complete case rather than isolated incidents. The revelation of James's background sent a ripple through the room. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling around her. Marcus Johnson leaned back in his chair, his expression both impressed and concerned. You owned a business. Thompson Consulting Group, James nodded. We specialized in corporate culture and ethical business practices before the 2008 crisis. When the market crashed, I chose to protect my employees' jobs instead of my profit margins. The company didn't survive, but I kept my principles. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a man who had sacrificed his own company to protect his workers, being harassed by someone who seemed to view employees as disposable assets. What would you like to see happen here, Mr. Thompson? Johnson asked. James straightened in his chair, years of boardroom experience evident in his posture. I'm not interested in personal revenge or monetary compensation, he stated clearly. What I want is systematic change. This isn't just about Mrs. Blackwood. It's about creating a workplace where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their position or background. Victoria finally found her voice. I had no idea you were. Educated? Qualified? Professional? James finished for her, his tone still remarkably calm. That's precisely the problem, Mrs. Blackwood. You never bothered to look past the uniform. The board members were now huddled together, whispering urgently. Marcus Johnson had pulled out his phone and was typing rapidly. The meeting that was supposed to be about $1 million partnership had transformed into something far more significant. As the morning wore on, James maintained his composure, answering questions with the same quiet dignity he'd shown while mopping floors. He presented additional evidence, suggested policy changes, and even outlined a comprehensive plan for workplace culture transformation. When the meeting finally ended, Marcus Johnson stood and extended his hand to James. Mr. Thompson, I believe we have a lot more to discuss, but not about a partnership with Atlantic Corporate Center. I'm more interested in your expertise in corporate culture consulting. As they left the conference room, James caught a glimpse of Victoria being escorted to HR. He felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only hope that this might lead to meaningful change. Sometimes, he reflected, the best response to discrimination isn't loud protest, but quiet, methodical action backed by irrefutable evidence. The janitor's cart still waited in the hallway, a reminder that dignity doesn't come from a job title, but from how one carries oneself in any position. In the days following the confrontation, Victoria Blackwood found herself in an unfamiliar position, one of powerlessness. Confined to a small temporary office while HR conducted their investigation, she spent hours scrolling through her phone, researching the man she had so grievously underestimated. The more she discovered about James Thompson, the more her stomach churned. Articles from business magazines dated over a decade ago showed him speaking at major conferences. Photos captured him receiving awards for ethical business practices. His company had been featured in Harvard Business Review for its innovative approach to corporate culture. One afternoon, while Victoria sat alone in her makeshift office, her computer pinged with an email from an old colleague at her previous company. The subject line read, "You need to see this." The attached video showed James Thompson giving a keynote speech at a major business convention in 2007. He stood confidently at the podium, wearing an expensive suit instead of a janitor's uniform, speaking about the importance of treating all employees with respect regardless of their position. The true measure of a company, his voice rang clear through her speakers, isn't its profit margins or market share. It's how it treats the person cleaning its floors or serving its coffee, because those people aren't just workers, they're the foundation of your corporate culture. Victoria closed the video, her hands shaking. She opened another browser tab and found more articles. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit, Thomson Consulting Group had been one of the few firms that refused to lay off employees. James had used his personal savings to keep salaries paid, eventually losing everything when the market continued to plummet. A knock on her door interrupted her research. It was Maria, her former assistant, now reassigned to another executive. Mrs. Blackwood. HR needs these forms filled out by end of day. Her voice was professional but cold. As Maria turned to leave, Victoria called out, "Wait." She hesitated, then asked, "Did you know about Mr. Thompson's background?" Maria paused in the doorway. "Everyone in the service staff knows. He's been mentoring some of us, helping with college applications, teaching business skills during lunch breaks." She added quietly, "He's done more for the workers here in 6 months than management has done in years." That evening, Victoria stayed late, continuing her investigation. She discovered that several major clients had withdrawn from negotiations with Atlantic Corporate Center over the past week. The business world was small, and word had spread quickly about the incident with Marcus Johnson. She found an old interview where James discussed his business philosophy. Success built on discrimination and fear isn't success at all. It's just failure waiting to happen. Victoria's phone buzzed again. Another email, this time from the board of directors. The subject line made her heart sink. Disciplinary meeting. Tomorrow 9 a.m. As she gathered her things to leave, she passed by the now empty janitor's closet where James had kept his supplies. A small sign was posted on the door, written in neat handwriting. "Treat your work with dignity, and dignity will follow." Through the window of her temporary office, she could see James across the street, entering a sleek office building. He was wearing a suit now, and even from this distance, she could see he carried himself differently. A sign on the building caught her attention: Global Tech Solutions. Victoria sat back in her chair, the full weight of her actions finally hitting her. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, stepping on anyone she considered beneath her, only to discover that the janitor she'd tormented was more accomplished and respected than she had ever been. Her phone buzzed one final time that evening, a notification from LinkedIn. "James Thompson has updated his profile, Executive Consultant, Corporate Culture Division, Global Tech Solutions." The irony wasn't lost on her. The man she had ordered to clean bathrooms was now in a position to reshape corporate culture across multiple organizations. Her actions hadn't just cost her a job, they had become a cautionary tale in business ethics. As she finally left the office that night, Victoria passed the cleaning crew, people she had never really looked at before. For the first time, she saw them as individuals, wondering about their stories, their dreams, their potential. It was a revelation that had come too late for her career at Atlantic Corporate Center, but perhaps not too late for her personal growth. On her desk, the HR paperwork still waited, its title stark against the white paper: Employee Conduct Review and Remediation Plan. The 9 a.m. board meeting at Atlantic Corporate Center carried the heavy atmosphere of a court proceeding. Victoria Blackwood sat alone on one side of the massive boardroom table, facing 12 stern-faced board members. The evidence against her was displayed on the large screen behind them: security footage, documented complaints, and financial projections showing the impact of lost contracts. "Mrs. Blackwood." Board Chairman Richard Wells began, his voice grave. "The events of the past week have forced us to conduct a thorough investigation into your conduct since joining our company. What we've uncovered is disturbing." The HR director, Sarah Chen, stepped forward with a thick folder. "We've documented 47 separate incidents of discriminatory behavior, 32 cases of workplace harassment, and countless instances of creating a hostile work environment." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. "And these are just the cases people were willing to report." Victoria's usual defiance had evaporated. The woman who once dominated these meetings with aggressive confidence now seemed to shrink in her chair. "The Global Tech Solutions Partnership, Another board member continued, would have been worth $50 million annually. Instead, they've not only withdrawn but have publicly stated their reasons for doing so. 3 other major clients have followed suit. The screen changed to show various news headlines. Corporate giant cuts ties over discrimination claims. Atlantic Corporate Center faces backlash over executives' racist behavior. Former business leader exposes toxic corporate culture. Furthermore, Chairman Wells added, "We've learned that Marcus Johnson has hired Mr. Thompson to lead a new division at Global Tech Solutions, focusing on corporate culture reformation. They're already developing training programs using this incident as a case study." Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. The very man she had humiliated was now in a position to turn her behavior into a teaching moment for other corporations. Sarah Chen continued reading from her report. The building's service staff has submitted a joint statement detailing a pattern of discriminatory behavior. We also have testimony from your former assistant about systematic harassment and abuse of power. The board members exchanged glances before Chairman Wells spoke again. Initially, we considered immediate termination. However, Mr. Thompson made an interesting suggestion during his exit interview. Victoria looked up, surprised. He proposed that instead of firing you, we should require you to undergo extensive sensitivity training and cultural competency education. Additionally, he suggested demoting you to a position where you would work directly with the people you once dismissed, to learn firsthand about their lives, their challenges, and their value. The proposal hung in the air like a heavyweight. Victoria's face flushed as she realized what this meant. She would have to work alongside the very people she had treated so poorly. "You have 2 options, Mrs. Blackwood," Chairman Wells stated firmly. "You can accept an immediate termination with no references and a public statement about your departure, or you can accept a 6-month probationary period in an entry-level position, combined with mandatory training and community service." The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria thought about her career, her reputation, and the lessons she'd learned over the past week. The image of James Thompson, moving from successful businessman to janitor without losing his dignity, flashed through her mind. Her voice cracked. "I accept the probation and training." Chairman Wells nodded. "Your new position will be in the mailroom, working under Supervisor Miguel Rodriguez, Maria's father. You'll attend daily sensitivity training sessions, and your progress will be closely monitored." As Victoria left the boardroom, clutching her new assignment papers, she passed by her former office. The nameplate had already been removed, and maintenance workers were packing up her belongings. One of them was an elderly gentleman she had berated just last week for taking too long to replace a light bulb. He looked at her now, not with anger or triumph, but with something that made her feel even worse, pity. The elevator ride to the basement mailroom felt like a descent into a new reality. The IT badge they gave her now read Mail Clerk instead of Senior Vice President. But somewhere in the midst of her humiliation, Victoria felt something unexpected, a small spark of relief. Perhaps, she thought, this was her chance to learn what James Thompson had known all along, that true success isn't about power over others, but about the strength of one's character. 3 months into her new position in the mailroom, Victoria Blackwood was a changed woman. Gone were the designer suits and imperious attitude, replaced by practical work clothes and a growing sense of humility. Under Miguel Rodriguez's supervision, she learned what it meant to be part of a team rather than looking down from above. The work was physically demanding, sorting mail, pushing heavy carts through the building's corridors, managing packages. Her perfectly manicured nails were now regularly chipped, and her expensive heels had been replaced with comfortable work shoes. But the biggest changes were happening inside. "Victoria, these packages need to go to the 15th floor," Miguel called out one morning. "And remember to smile, a little kindness goes a long way." She nodded, remembering how she used to barely acknowledge Miguel's existence when she was an executive. Now, she saw the wisdom in his leadership style, firm but fair, always teaching, always looking out for his team. During her lunch breaks, Victoria attended mandatory sensitivity training sessions led by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a corporate culture specialist. Initially resistant, she gradually began to open up about her past behaviors and prejudices. "Tell me about your background, Victoria," Dr. Martinez asked during one session. When did you first start seeing people as beneath you? Victoria thought carefully before answering. I think. I think it started when I was climbing the corporate ladder. I believed I had to be tough, had to prove I was better than everyone else. Somewhere along the way, I started confusing cruelty with strength. Meanwhile, across town at Global Tech Solutions, James Thompson was thriving in his new role. His department had grown rapidly, with companies nationwide seeking his expertise in workplace culture transformation. He occasionally visited Atlantic Corporate Center to check on the progress of the changes he had helped implement. One such morning, James entered the mailroom for a scheduled observation. Victoria was sorting packages, her back turned to the door. When she turned around and saw him, she froze momentarily, but then continued her work with deliberate care. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, her voice lacking its former arrogance. James observed her for a moment. "How are you finding the work, Mrs. Blackwood?" "It's educational," she replied, then added more honestly, "It's humbling. I needed that." A small smile crossed James's face. Humility is often the best teacher. Later that afternoon, Victoria sat in her weekly progress review with the HR director and Miguel. The reports were encouraging. No incidents of discriminatory behavior, positive feedback from coworkers, and a noticeable improvement in her attitude. "There's something else," Miguel added. "Last week, when Tommy from maintenance was having trouble with his son's college applications, Victoria stayed late to help him. She's been tutoring him in writing his essays." Victoria blushed slightly. I know about college applications. It seemed like the right thing to do." The HR director made a note in her file. "This is exactly the kind of change we were hoping to see." As weeks passed, Victoria's transformation became more evident. She learned the names of everyone in the building, not just the executives, but the security guards, maintenance workers, and cleaning staff. She began organizing a weekly lunch gathering where employees from all levels could share meals and stories. One day, she found herself helping a new janitor learn the building's layout, the same task she had once mocked others for not doing quickly enough. As they walked the corridors together, she shared tips about the most efficient routes and introduced him to key people on each floor. The irony wasn't lost on her when the janitor asked, "How do you know so much about this building?" "Let's just say I've seen it from every angle," she replied with a small smile. During her final sensitivity training session, Dr. Martinez asked, "What's the most important lesson you've learned?" Victoria thought about James Thompson, about Miguel, about all the people she had looked down on, and about how each of them had shown her more dignity than she had ever shown them. "I learned that position doesn't define worth," she answered. "And that true leadership isn't about power over others. It's about lifting people up, not pushing them down." As she pushed her mail cart through the building that afternoon, Victoria realized something surprising. She was happier now, doing honest work with people she respected, than she had ever been in her corner office. The view, she discovered, was actually better from the ground up. 2 years had passed since the incident that changed everything at Atlantic Corporate Center. The building's lobby now featured a large plaque announcing its recognition as Corporate America's Most Improved Workplace Culture 2024. Below the plaque sat a framed photo of the team that made it possible, and there, standing proudly among them, was Victoria Blackwood. After completing her 6-month probation in the mailroom, Victoria had surprised everyone by requesting to stay in a non-executive position. She now served as the company's employee relations coordinator, working directly with staff at all levels to ensure fair treatment and open communication. On this particular morning, Victoria stood nervously in the building's main conference room, preparing for a special presentation. The room was packed with executives from various companies, all gathered for a workplace culture seminar. At the front of the room, James Thompson, now a renowned corporate consultant, stood ready to introduce her. 2 years ago, James began, this building witnessed a transformation that began with a conflict but ended in redemption. Today, the person who sparked that change will share her story. He turned and gestured to Victoria. "Mrs. Blackwood, the floor is yours." Victoria approached the podium, wearing a simple but professional outfit, a far cry from her once intimidating power suits. She looked out at the audience and took a deep breath. "My name is Victoria Blackwood, and I was once the villain in a story about workplace discrimination," she began. Today, I'm here to tell you how losing everything helped me find something more valuable, my humanity. The audience listened intently as she shared her journey. She spoke about her fall from power, her time in the mailroom, and the lessons learned from people she had once considered beneath her. Miguel Rodriguez taught me more about leadership in 6 months than all my years in executive training, she explained. He showed me that true authority comes from respect, not fear. In the audience, Miguel sat with his daughter Maria, both now respected members of the company's management team. Maria had recently been promoted to Director of Operations, the position Victoria once held. As Victoria continued her presentation, James watched with satisfaction. His consulting firm, Thompson and Partners, had grown into a leading authority on workplace reform. The incident with Victoria had become a cornerstone of his training programs, but not as an example of punishment, rather as a story of transformation. The hardest part wasn't losing my position, Victoria admitted to the audience. It was facing the person I had become. Every morning, I had to look in the mirror and ask myself, how did I let power change me so completely? She then shared some of her initiatives from the past year: mentoring programs for entry-level employees, diversity training workshops, and a revolutionary role reversal program where executives spent time working alongside service staff. Near the end of her presentation, Victoria revealed something unexpected. Next month, I'll be joining Thompson and Partners as their Director of Transformation Programs. But not because of my executive experience, because of my time in the mailroom, where I learned that every job deserves respect and every person has value. James stepped forward to join her at the podium. Mrs. Blackwood's story isn't just about personal change, he added. It's about the possibility of institutional change. One person's transformation can ripple through an entire organization. After the presentation, as the audience filed out, Victoria found herself face to face with a young executive who reminded her of her former self. The woman admitted, "I've been tough on my support staff, thinking it made me a stronger leader. But now..." Victoria smiled knowingly. "Why don't we take a walk down to the mailroom? I'd like to introduce you to some of the best leaders I've ever met." Later that evening, as Victoria packed up her office for her move to Thompson and Partners, she paused to look at a photo on her desk. It showed her sorting mail alongside Miguel, both of them laughing at something long forgotten. Next to it sat her old nameplate from her executive days, kept as a reminder of who she used to be. As she left the building, she stopped to chat with the evening cleaning crew, not out of obligation, but out of genuine friendship. Walking to her car, Victoria reflected on how a journey that began with humiliation had ended with humility, and how losing her power had ultimately made her stronger. The lights of Atlantic Corporate Center shone behind her, illuminating a building that now stood as a testament to the possibility of change, both personal and professional. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest victories come disguised as defeats, and the best lessons are taught by those we least expect to be our teachers.